Okay, well, thanks everyone for coming. My name's William Smith of the GPA department. This is the second face-to-face research event we've had this semester. Basically, the idea is just to see how it goes, you know, because we haven't had face-to-face events for about two years, probably even longer. Last month we had a nice session with James. That was James and I doing a kind of Q&A about far-right populism in Europe. Today we're going to have, delighted to say we've got Professor Seanon Wong joining us, presenting material relevant to his, this is relevant to your current GRF project, isn't it, Sean? And Sean's our resident IR specialist. He's actually, as far as I can tell, he's the only IR specialist employed in the entire university. I don't know. I know it sort of depends how you define IR, and it also depends how you define the status of certain faculty who can't go.
Does it mean that our university is so internationalized enough?
Yeah, our university wants to internationalize, but only students, I think, not intellectually. But we are lucky that even though Sean is one of our only IR scholars, he's certainly one of the best around, so we're very fortunate to have him. His area of specialism is actually diplomacy, which is a fascinating subject, the kind of micro-politics of diplomacy, which I think is an issue that cuts across IR. It certainly has relevance for international political theory, and I think also for comparative politics, actually, although the disciplinary approach might be somewhat different. But anyway, today you're going to talk to us about this, something that I know absolutely nothing about. I think, you know, RQ spirit at work. I think you have actually explained it to me and I still don't understand. I think I'll be more enlightened after your talk. Sean's going to talk for about 40 minutes and then we'll have 20 minutes for questions and then we'll go and have a beer. Okay, so over to you, Sean.
So thank you very much. Thanks for coming here on a Friday afternoon. So what I have for you today is a sort of a side project I've been working on and off for maybe a year. It's still very much work in progress. I very much look forward to hearing your thoughts and picking your brains in the Q&A afterwards, after my presentation. So let me begin with an observation. Okay? So a certain disconnect that I see exists between, on the one hand, some of the things we learn in international relations theory, on how the world allegedly works, but on the other hand, how the world actually seems to work. So on the one hand, I argue that in much of IR theory, it is generally assumed that whenever a country suffers a loss in an international conflict, its meaning is straightforward and known to its people. So they know without much ambiguity who's the winner, who's the loser, but more importantly, how to feel about the experience. In here, I define a loss broadly, right? So it could be a country's wholesale defeat in a war, or it could be some event or episode that has happened in the course of a conflict that would by itself be seen as a defeat, a retreat, a setback, or at least some sort of failure. So, for instance, when in 2012, Barack Obama publicly declared that the use of chemical weapons would be the red line the Syrian government must not cross in its civil war, but it later did cross anyway, and Obama did nothing about it, we would say that Obama had retreated from his threat, or that he had failed in his effort to deter the Syrians. Obama, in this case, lost, right? And that was indeed how many Americans saw it back then. Now, the assumption that winning or losing is a relatively clear-cut concept is, in fact, very fundamental to a wide range of research in IR theory. So, for instance, in an audience cost theory, right, the audience cost theory argues that, as in the case of Obama, right, a leader who retreats from a threat will be subject to punishment by his own people. But this theory makes sense only if his people know a retreat when they see it, and more importantly, they feel it as such. This assumption is also built firmly into the diversionary theory of war in IR. So the theory suggests that the leaders who are having troubles at home will be inclined to initiate or escalate the conflict abroad because, according to one rationalist strand of the theory, his domestic standing would improve if he wins the conflict. But again, this logic only makes sense if we assume that his people can have an objective understanding of whether he is leading them to victory or is he instead leading them to defeat. However, if we look at the empirical record, the perception of winning and losing is often more malleable, more fluid, more ambiguous. Right? People's feeling of winning and losing, right, much like how you may be seeing the head of a rabbit or a duck in this picture, right, can be subject to manipulation. A loss can be so-called spun, right, by those who have the incentive to do so, that is, those in power, into something that feels less like a loss. In more extreme cases, it could even feel like a victory. So let me give you some examples. The evacuation of Allied forces from the beaches and harbor in Dunkirk in 1940 was really an ignominious defeat, right? Very clear-cut defeat. It was a retreat. So as Winston Churchill said bluntly at the time, wars are not won by evacuations. Still, that did not prevent leaders since then from spinning it into something that feels more like a win. Right? So as two observers once wrote about Dunkirk, even military defeats can be perceived as victories. Dunkirk in itself was a success. Thousands of soldiers escaped, but the drama focused attention away from the wider picture of disastrous military defeat for Britain and France. And Dunkirk, I argue, was not an exception. Right? So consider India's war with China in 1962. India, as we all probably know, very much lost the war. That's sort of the historical consensus. Still, that didn't prevent people from trying to portray its final retreat, India's final retreat, as something good, as something virtuous, something admirable. Right? So as a major newspaper, an Indian newspaper opined at the time, if Dunkirk has gone down in history as the best example of British courage and determination in the face of the greatest odds, the planned withdrawal of several thousand Indian Jawans, soldiers, and officers will surely be regarded by future historians as a great page in military history. And just last year, Armenia had very clearly lost the war with its neighbor, Azerbaijan. Right? This would be an extremely difficult case to spin, right? To present Armenia's stunning defeat as anything but, right? A stunning defeat. But that still did not prevent its prime minister from at least trying. So the first thing he did after he lost the war was he went onto Facebook and declared, quote, "This is not a victory, but there is no defeat. Until you find yourself defeated, we will never recognize ourselves as losers, and this should be the beginning of our era of national unification and rebirth. We fought to the end, and we will win." Now, examples such as these show that in the aftermath of a conflict, right, governments and their domestic allies, such as their fellow partisan and sympathetic members of the press, right, often try to alleviate or even reverse the people's, their citizens' sense of loss through propaganda. But how can that be achieved exactly? Okay, so before we answer these questions, we need to address something more fundamental, which is more fundamentally what determines a citizen's perception of winning versus losing, right, in an international conflict. Well, the IR literature has provided some answers. However, I argue that they only give us half the picture because they're based on what I call the cognitive rational model of win-loss perception. So what this means is that judgment about winning and losing involves some rational assessment of whether certain goals or aims can be achieved, say, for instance, taking over a disputed piece of land or forcing an opponent to back down, and whether such goals and aims have been achieved with reasonable means at some reasonable cost. Right? The process, right, it's also cognitive, right, because assessment is not automatic. It is not predetermined. It is a process, again, so an outcome of learning and updating of beliefs based on the information that comes in as a conflict unfolds. Right? So just speaking in the abstract, let me give you more substance to what I just said. Right? So for instance, it is often assumed that the average citizen does not care or is knowledgeable enough about foreign policy to have an informed opinion. He therefore relies on cues from those who are in a better position than him to pass a judgment, such as other leaders in the government, leaders in the opposition, in the media, etc. These cues could also come from outside international actors, right? So, for example, if a government fails to follow through with a threat to use force, but opposition leaders sort of agree that that's the right thing to do, or that the use of force is not endorsed by the U.S. Security Council, then backing down would be more sensible and considered less of a retreat, right, than if any of these conditions were absent. Or it could be that a citizen is provided with new information about the substance of a government policy or the viability of alternative policies to achieve the same goals and aims. So, for instance, the argument that the government may argue and provide evidence that persisting with a threat or a military offensive or not conceding would actually harm the national interest, or that the cost of not dealing with it too high, or that some policy alternatives such as imposing economic sanctions instead of using force have become available, or that some third party has offered to mediate a conflict. Backing down under any of these conditions would make sense and therefore again be less seen as a loss, right? Or the government may try to reset the agenda, to reframe and reprioritize the goals and aims for the conflict, emphasizing those it has succeeded and downplaying those it has failed. So, for instance, when the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan recently, a common narrative the Biden administration and others tried to promote was that American objective had always been to rid the country of terrorists who could harm America. They were not there for state building or promoting democracy. Since they've accomplished what they claimed they set out to do, they've won rather than lost the war in Afghanistan. And finally, and this is perhaps especially true for authoritarian countries, the government could simply withhold information that otherwise shines a bad light on its performance in the conflict. So, for instance, when Chinese and Indian troops clashed in the Himalayas in June last year, the Chinese government was silent about their casualties and censored discussions of it domestically. It only acknowledged almost a year later that it suffered 4 casualties. Or 3 years earlier, in 2017, after the standoff between the two countries at Doklam, which is the Himalayas, ended, the Chinese government did not disclose to its own people the fact that it had pulled out its troops and construction equipment that is stationed in the disputed area that sparked the crisis to begin with. Right? So without this crucial piece of information, that is, the Chinese forces had retreated, the belief that China had prevailed over India became easier to sell to the Chinese people. But I argue that the feeling of winning and losing, right, is not only cognitive rational, like the different explanations I offered just now, right? The feeling of winning and losing, right, is also social psychological, right? It involves the experience of elevated or deflated collective self-esteem as a citizen of a country, that is, in the language of social psychology, as a member of the national in-group, vis-a-vis the out-group, that is, the adversary in question. So let me elaborate, right? According to the American Psychological Association, collective self-esteem refers to, quote, individuals' subjective assessment of that portion of their self-concept that is based on their membership in social groups, such as families, teams, and schools, as well as on categories that have psychological significance for them, such as being a member of a certain race, ethnicity, or nationality. In other words, an individual's collective self-esteem is how he feels about himself, his reputation, honor, status, self-worth, etc., not for being himself per se, but for being a member of a certain social group. And I argue there's a lot of that going on too when one's group loses or wins a conflict, in international politics, but also in other realms of life. Okay, so let me give you some examples to clarify how the perception of winning versus losing can have both a cognitive, rational, and a social psychological component, and how they are in theory distinct, right, and can be analyzed separately. So I'm not a sports person, so I'm not a sports person, right, and I'm not a fan of any sports team, but for the purpose of for the purpose of making money, right? I can still place a bet on, say, a match between Manchester United and Liverpool, right? If I bet on the Manchester United winning, but it loses, I know in my cognitive rational assessment of what just happened, right, that I failed to achieve my objective. Not only that, I've lost the money I bet. On the other hand, it could be that I'm not betting on anything, but I'm a huge fan of the Manchester United. Being a fan of the Manchester United is part of my social identity. So when it loses a match against Liverpool, its most significant outgroup because of the long-term rivalry, I feel bad. I experience lower collective self-esteem. On the contrary, Liverpool fans would be elated, right? They feel pride. They would experience, on the other hand, higher collective self-esteem. And I'm not just making this up, but this is a well-documented phenomenon in the study of intergroup relations in social psychology. Okay, so that's a very easy and intuitive example. Now going back to IR, right, the same distinction can also be made in, say, audience cost theory's explanation for why a leader might be subject to punishment if he backs down from a threat. It could be because backing down would, like in people's cognitive rational assessment, lead to some actual material loss, such as concessions on whatever that's being fought over, or that backing down would mean failing to achieve certain objectives. The leader should therefore be held accountable. He is incompetent. He should no longer be the leader, right? He's being punished. Or on the other hand, it could be because from a social psychological point of view, backing down would, right, as James Seanon put it in his seminal article on audience cost in 1994, lead to a, quote, loss of credibility, faith, or honor. In other words, esteem, right, for the country, for the in-group. Now, I've explained how governments may manage their citizens' perception of losing from a cognitive, rational perspective. The question from a social psychological perspective then is that in parallel, right, could they somehow achieve the same after a loss by mitigating or even reversing the harm done to their people's esteem? As it turns out, scholars of social identity theory in psychology have been asking and answering that question for quite some time. And this is what they've discovered. People, including you and me, right, engage all the time in what are known as social creative strategies concerning their group identity to make themselves feel better, to maintain a healthy level of collective esteem. So as psychologists Henry Petchko and John Turner explained back in the 1980s, social creative strategies are strategies whereby, quote, group members seek positive distinctiveness for the in-group by redefining and altering elements of the comparative situation with the out-group. So returning to the context of international politics, right, what this means is that if a loss or a defeat or a retreat or some setback for country A against country B is the so-called current element of the comparative situation that makes the citizens of country A to have lower esteem, then this harm could, in theory, be lessened if people's attention can be drawn elsewhere to some different elements of the comparative situation between the two groups that would make country A look not as bad. And I argue that the use of such strategies is ubiquitous. After all, no one likes to feel like a loser, and governments do not want their people to feel like losers. And so metaphorically, and perhaps I guess just to make my project more catchy, right, I label these strategies all together the IQ theory of loss management. So for those of you who know something about modern Chinese literature, the name refers to the title character in the satirical novella, the true story of IQ Zhengzhuan, right, by Lu Xun. And the novella, IQ as a lowly peasant from rural China, a loser in practically everything he does in life, he nevertheless always manages to concoct in his mind a sense of what Lu Xun calls like spiritual victory. Victory that is spiritually, subjectively felt, rather than achieved based on some objective, cognitive, rational measure of success. Now, in my close reading of the psychological literature, I have identified 10 strategies, which I label S1 to S10, that are particularly relevant to IR. So in the remainder of my presentation, I'm going to show you how these strategies were put to use in a number of historical episodes or anecdotes, but also along the way with a case study on how the Chinese government manages people's sense of loss in the immediate aftermath of Japan's so-called nationalization of the disputed Diaoyu Senkaku Islands in September 2012. Particularly attention will be given to the themes expressed in the editorials of the two major state-owned newspapers, People's Daily, 人民日报, and the Global Times, 环球时报. Now, let me give you a brief background of the incident. As I'm sure many of you remember, the simmering dispute between the two countries came to a boil in 2012. A lot of things happened that year, but the climax of their confrontation came when Tokyo proceeded with its so-called purchase, right, of the islands from their alleged private owners on September 11th. The incident could hardly be more humiliating for the Chinese, not the least because of the nationalistic frenzy the government itself had whipped up in the days leading up to it. Right? So, Chinese President Hu Jintao warned the Japanese Prime Minister against the move in person, right? In a very high-profile move, just 2 days before the actual purchase. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a strongly worded warning just the day before the purchase, and the state-owned newspapers themselves trumpeted some of the most hard-line threats in their editorials. Right? So, as Jessica Wise put it, in the book that I know I see Seanon carrying, right? In the book, right? So as Jessica observed, right? Quote, the timing of the purchase was seen as a major blow and a loss of face for China's leaders. Okay. So in situations like this, what can a government do to manage the damage done to the people's collective self-esteem? First, a government may try to reverse the value associated with the loss, right, the setback, transforming it into from something bad into something desirable, right? So it spins it into something laudable, admirable. So the Allies' retreat at Dunkirk and India's defeat during the Sino-Indian War, I discussed at the beginning, would be two prime examples. Second, a government may redirect popular attention away from the loss to another dimension of comparison with the out-group that is more favorable to the in-group. So in sports, for instance, plenty of research has shown that when a team is losing its fan, right, that is those who identify with it as an in-group, would tend to focus on an attribute, right, or some dimension of comparison that is less relevant to the current performance, right? Such as the belief that the opposing team has played dirty or that their fans are referees.
All true.
Trust the process.
The Chinese and American battle.
So similarly, right, in the immediate aftermath of Japan's purchase of the Diaoyu Islands, Chinese state media went all out highlighting dimensions of comparison that would make the in-group glow. For instance, just 2 days after the purchase, the People's Daily featured on its front page multiple articles that glorified China in a range of achievements that met as great power. Aerospace technology, emissions, deep sea research, quantum communications, etc. The emphasis of these articles, which I won't go into detail, was not only how far China has come in these dimensions per se, but how it will lead the race against its global competitors. And 2 days later, the Global Times a Global Times editorial assured that, notwithstanding the setback, China had actually already won, but in other ways, in the Diaoyu Islands. So first, it said that Japan was the veritable instigator and therefore lost in reason. Right? China therefore had already won in terms of being reasonable. Second, the Chinese people are high in morale to seek revenge. The Japanese have far lower morale. They feel anxious. China therefore had already also won in posture. Okay. And Third, China could redeploy its resources to Northeast Asia to confront Japan. By contrast, Japan had the most opponents in the region. China had therefore already won forcefully in the strategy. Right? So to me, it's very interesting how the language is couched, right, explicitly in terms of winning and losing. Right? The government clearly wanted to keep its people in light of such direct affront from the Japanese, right? It wants its people to see, right, see themselves as the winner. The next two social creative strategies, S3 and S4, enhance and in-groups collective self-esteem by degrading the adversary and occasionally other relevant out-groups. So first, government propaganda made what social psychologists call a blast at the adversary, right? Casting it as unworthy of comparison with the in-group. It derogates the out-group by calling it names, insulting, slandering, and dehumanizing it. Second, a government may redirect the public's attention to other out-groups of a lower status for what social psychologists call a more positive downward comparison. So anecdotally, and for those of you who are from mainland China or lived in mainland China would understand what I'm referring to here, right? So there's a long-running joke among mainland Chinese about how propaganda works on state television, right? Which is that during its nightly 30-minute news broadcast of Seanon, right? 10 minutes are always spent on reporting how well off the Chinese people are, followed by another 10 minutes of how miserable, poor, disaster-stricken many parts of the world have been, right? So such would be a very good example of positive downward comparison, right? So in this case, the Chinese government certainly knows how to make its people feel good about themselves. And indeed, in the immediate aftermath of Japan's purchase of the Diaoyu Islands, propaganda was relentless, blasting at Japan. Right? So China's status was also elevated through incidental comparisons with other lesser outgroups, particularly the Philippines and Vietnam. Insults, nicknames, and derogatory metaphors were rampant. The Global Times, for instance, opined with the Chinese saying, "Kill the chicken, scare the monkey." Japan was just volunteering to be the chicken. It wrote the next day, Japan is only a play puppet of the US, and play puppets are cheap like the Philippines. The difference between these two countries, of the Philippines and Japan, Philippines, is just one of a small Barbie versus a big Barbie. For China, the Diaoyu Islands conflict is just a game of beating the dogs in front of their master. Even Russia may one day decide to extend its hand and toy with Japan a little bit. The newspaper also used repeatedly the derogatory slang "Little Japan," right, to refer to Japan. It editorialized that the country should be dismissed as Asia's unruly rabble. I can't find a better translation for this. That's Gao Ming. Yuma. Gao Ming.
Yeah, it's like little.
Yuma, the English.
Something very
No,
moral?
no.
Okay. Let's work on the tell me the translation after. We can pull our brains together. Okay. It said that China would fix Japan whenever needed, but it should not be too psychologically hung up on it. I forgot the original Chinese expression. I forgot the word. I should have put it there. In another article, the newspaper called Japan a small neighbor that's not quite worth the attention, a nuisance, just another Vietnam, another Philippines. So while the two strategies I just discussed, right, worked, right, by degrading the outgroup, the next two strategies I will be discussing work in the opposite direction. They work by aggrandizing the in-group. So first, instead of being something bad, a loss could be portrayed as compliant with some desirable norms or standards held by an even larger group reference, usually the international community. The basis of comparison is as such shifted away from the out-group. Right? So for instance, that would be the psychological rationale behind Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev's attempt to justify his decision to halt missiles built up in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So he proclaimed, right, in the name of the greater good of humanity, in order to save the world, we must retreat. And in the case of China, Kai Kwek and Ian Johnson, for those of you who are studying in Chinese studies field, you know who these people are, right? They've shown in a relatively recent article in International Security that Chinese respondents in a survey experiment who are reminded that the Chinese are an inherently peace-loving people, are more forgiving of their government for retreating in an international crisis. And that was indeed a theme repeatedly invoked during the Diary Islands dispute. So the government's peaceful handling of the crisis was depicted as praiseworthy not only by its own evaluation, but also according to propaganda in the eyes of others. On September 14th, for instance, the People's Daily opined that China had always followed a policy of friendliness and partnership with its neighbors. China's peaceful development had driven regional development. Its fine international image cannot be altered. Next, government propaganda may try to, what psychologists call, recategorize the in-group upward, right, into an alternative in-group of a high status, and in doing so to enable members of that in-group to so-called bask in that identity. And as you might have expected, I guess, given what I just said, right, that was also a recurring theme in the Diary Islands dispute. If there was any reason for the Chinese to feel inferior before, the People's Daily and Global Times claimed they could now look down on an arch rival. Japan is no longer even in the same league. Right? So for instance, readers were repeatedly reminded that China is part of the world's nuclear club, but Japan is not. Another message that came up time and again was how China had surged ahead in power. For instance, the Global Times wrote on September 18th, China has become a country that could destroy Japan. However, in the current crisis, China demonstrated the maturity and responsibleness expected of a truly great power. It wanted respect and recognition of the international society. It is time, the newspaper continued 10 days later, for the Chinese people to rebuild their sense of psychological superiority over Japan. But most interestingly, the government was explicit about its intention to demobilize its citizens through upward recategorization. The people were actually discouraged from taking their anger to the streets, like in light of Japan's humiliation. Right? As such, it's going to the street, taking their anger to the streets, was being framed explicitly as contrary to their newfound membership, newfound identity, right, as the world, one of the world's great powers. That's very interesting to me personally, right? So the Global Times, for instance, editorialized on September 18th that protests were once an expression of China that was frail and weak. They have become a habit. But the page should now be turned. China is already a great power. The Americans do not protest against foreign countries in the streets. Only citizens of small powers and weak powers, such as those in the Middle East, right? This is in the original text. Protest because they protest, right? The citizens of these small powers or weak powers, they have to protest because it is the only means that they have. The Chinese people's reaction to foreign affairs should therefore transform to one more suited, right, to a great power, a strong power. Now, the 6 social creative strategies I've discussed so far, right, work by redefining or altering the identity of the out group, the in group itself, right, or the dimension or issue upon which the two groups are being compared. The next 3 strategies I'm going to discuss are different. Right? They bolster an in-group's collective self-esteem, but altering its reference in time in making sense of the current laws. So this is why I label here, like altering temporal reference of comparison. So first, in 7th strategy, S7, government propaganda may lead its people to imagine a future that is optimistic, perhaps unduly optimistic vis-a-vis the outgroup. And so as the German scholar and historian Wolfgang Schiffelbusch wrote, nations do not usually embrace defeat in their mythology. They do everything in their power to deny it or to turn the tables by imagining by imagining the victor as the loser of the next round of warfare. Right. And in fact, this observation applies just as well in other aspects of life. So for instance, plenty of research in psychology have shown that when a competitive sports team loses a match, right, to make themselves feel better, its players and supporters and fans are often quick to exaggerate the probability of winning against the opposing team the next time, right, in the future. And as discussed earlier, that would be what the Armenian Prime Minister was attempting to do when he proclaimed in the aftermath of his war with Azerbaijan, we will win. Right? Similarly, in the Diaoyu Island dispute, one of the first things Chinese propaganda did was to assure its people of its bright future. The Global Times wrote in just a span of several days passages like China's economy will double that of Japan soon, triple, quadruple, or even more, with China growing more powerful by the day. Losing the Diaoyu Island is impermissible. In the end, Japan will be will certainly be the first to budge. Just wait and see. China will certainly make the Japanese look bad. It will give them a direct blow to the head. Now, the next social creative strategy I'm going to discuss would be temporarily, right? In terms of time, temporarily the opposite of what I just elaborated. Instead of looking into the future, a government directs popular attention away from the current loss to how the in-group has fared well against the out-group in the past. It resorts to what psychologists call temporal comparisons to achieve higher collective self-esteem. So a recent example I have here would be how the Chinese media referenced repeatedly the country's resistance against the Americans in the Korean War some 7 years ago in its ongoing trade war with the US. Right? You're referencing your competition now with the US with something that happened 7 years ago. Similarly, in the days after Japan's nationalization of the Diaoyu Island in 2012, the Chinese media was keen to remind its people over and over again how China had beaten Japan in World War II. Next, this is also a strategy that alters the temporal reference of comparison. Right? A government may try to reduce the significance of a current loss by contextualizing it over a longer period of time. So anecdotally, when US President Donald Trump unexpectedly imposed a steep increase in tariffs against Chinese imports in May 2019, the Global Times editor-in-chief, Hu Xijing, consult his readers by reminding them how the setback was only a small case, 小事一宗, and with many more cases of success in the 5 millennia of Chinese history. Right. And that was, returning to our case, that was also the message the Chinese government attempted to spread, basically daily, right, every day in the aftermath of Japan's purchase of the islands. Basically, the message was, a broader perspective of history is required. The Chinese people should not be too hung up on what has only been a minor setback, a bump in the road in the grander scheme of things. So contrary to the state-owned newspapers' belligerent rhetoric before the purchase, it would now be wise not to respond too forcefully, because the payoff down the road will even be bigger and more certain. So for instance, on the day of Japan's purchase, the Global Times stated that China's long-term objectives, right, those are the temporal re-engineering here, right? The long-term objective should be to assert de facto control of the islands. There was no use for people to be angry, agitated. Now is not the best time to solve once and for all the problem. The Diaoyu Islands cannot run. The islands will one day be safely in China's pocket. In the course of reclaiming the islands, China's old-time rival, meaning Japan, will be subdued. It involves a process. Right? So again, the term process basically gives an impression like it's process. It's a longer period of time instead of just focusing on this one incident of insult, of affront from the Japanese. And more effort was made. In the subsequent days to convince the Chinese people to be more farsighted. The People Daily wrote on September 17th, so that's like 6 days after the incident, that China should be ready to fight a protracted war. Time is on China's side, right, the following day. The Global Times echoed this viewpoint days later. The dispute is a veritable, protracted war. It cannot be rushed. The public is understandably emotionally excited, but it does not have enough patience and stamina. So to drive home the point, it continued 3 days later. The more stretched out and complicated, the more unbearable it would be for Japan, not China. And I'm almost done here. The final strategy, and this is perhaps a bit of a counterintuitive. A government may try to blur the identity boundary between the in-groups, between the in-group and the out-group. It engages the in-group in what social psychologists call a superordinate recategorization. That is, after a loss, the group distinction between us and them is transcended into a more inclusive we. The in-group's identity becomes less prominent, as such damage done to its collective self-esteem becomes less acute. Well, I do not find this strategy much at work, actually, in the Diaoyu Island dispute. However, it doesn't mean it is any less ubiquitous in international politics. So, for instance, in March 1939, Hitler ignored Britain's warning and invaded Czechoslovakia. When Britain failed to follow up with any action, some of its ruling elites tried to rationalize it, arguing how it would be a calamity if the, quote, two races which are most akin were to fight each other. So blurring the identity boundary between the British and the Germans, that would be an instance of superordinate recategorization. Right? So another very recent example would be how certain Chinese netizens reacted to Taiwan's performance in the recent Olympics. Right? So whenever China won a game against the Chinese Taipei team, in ping pong for instance, people were happy naturally. Some even commented how they've so-called taught the forces of Taiwan independence a lesson, right? But when they lost the game so when mainland China lost the game against the Taiwanese, most memorably in the match for the gold medal in badminton men's double, if you might remember, some netizens were quick to obscure the significance of the loss by highlighting how they were, after all Chinese, right? So Taiwan's win was also just like China's win. Okay, I actually find this very much in play in another big case study I'm looking at, which is the Sino-Indian conflict in 2017. I'll take a look for another time. So just to conclude, so I'd like to make clear some of the implications of this research. Okay, so the so what question, okay, well, how does it actually improve the stock of knowledge in IR? So first, if governments always have to some extent, right, the leeway to make a loss to feel less like a loss, to wiggle their way out of the situation their citizens might otherwise interpret as a loss, then the assumption in IR that winning and losing is a straightforward experience is problematic. Right? This might explain why, as some scholars have puzzled over recently, right, audience cost does not seem to be as forthcoming in many empirical cases as one assumed. Second, there's been a growing literature on how humiliation can be a cause of conflict in IR. According to this literature, humiliation is more or less zero-sum. A country's gain in status by humiliating another country is that other country's loss, and that's why they fight. However, my research would imply that governments could have at their disposal, right, certain social psychological tools, meaning the 10 social creative strategies I discussed, to soften the brunt of humiliation, to make the target of humiliation feel less bad about themselves, right? So humiliation then may not be so zero-sum after all. Third, some of you might be aware of this debate that's been going on to what extent the Chinese state is able to shape the public opinion in the realm of foreign policy, or on the contrary, is it mostly reacting passively to public opinion and being led by it? I don't have a definitive answer, but my research would imply that perhaps this balance of power between state and society would tip more in favor of the state rather than society. And finally, and perhaps I guess most obviously, my research contributes to our understanding of propaganda, right? By looking at it from a psychological perspective, something that, as far as I know, hasn't been explored as much in the literature, in psychology or in political science. How much time do I have left? Maybe two more minutes?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So that said, as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, this research is still very much work in progress. There are a couple of things I intend to do moving forward. First, I'm working on more case studies in relation to China. But to demonstrate that my theory has wider applications beyond China and in an authoritarian context, I also intend to look into several cases involving India and certain other Western democracies. I also acknowledge that at the end of the day, right, for those of you who are very, very insistent upon making causal inferences, I guess I concede or acknowledge that my theory is about how propaganda works to affect an individual's collective self-esteem, but case studies can only show that propaganda has happened. Strictly speaking, it cannot prove that it is really doing the work at the level of individual psychology. Right? So to achieve that, I guess we need to be creative and use methods such as survey experiments, and that is what I intend to do for quite some time now. Peter would know. So what you see here is a screenshot of excerpts of a survey experiment I've been designing on Qualtrics. And I can explain that in greater detail later. I guess not all of you will be interested. This is a survey experiment I hope to field sometime, I know in the future, maybe this is what my GRF grant is about really. Again, I'd be happy to discuss and elaborate, and again, take your brains about this and about other things on my presentation, the Q&A. So I'm pretty much done here. Thank you for bearing with me for the past 15 minutes or so. I know I overran. I'm going to stop here.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sean. Great.